The wind, a relentless artist of desolation, sculpted the Montana landscape into a masterpiece of white. For 3 days it had howled its mournful symphony, a dirge for the sun, burying everything under a thick, suffocating blanket of snow. In the heart of this frozen maelstrom stood a solitary cabin, a tiny defiant fist clenched against the fury of the elements. This was Sylvie's world. And on the 3rd day, as the very air seemed to crackle with the intensity of the storm, a frantic, desperate pounding on her door shattered the fragile peace. Every instinct honed by years of solitude and survival screamed at her to ignore it. But a deeper, more stubborn part of her, a flicker of humanity she couldn't quite extinguish, refused to let another soul be consumed by the white hell outside. With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, she unbolted the door. The man who collapsed across her threshold was a ghost of a man, half frozen and bleeding. A fugitive. She knew it in her bones. What she couldn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that this desperate stranger was the son of the most powerful man in the territory, Judge Alistair Blackwood, and that the storm that had trapped her was about to become the least of her worries. The world beyond Sylvie Hayes's small circular window was a swirling vortex of white. Snow driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee erased the familiar lines of the mountains, the stoic silhouettes of the pines, and the winding path to the nearest town of Redemption, a place she hadn't seen in over a month and felt no particular longing for now. The blizzard was in its 3rd day, a relentless siege that had shrunk her existence to the 4 log walls of her cabin, the crackle of the fire in the hearth, and the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock her father had built. Sylvie was a creature of this solitude, molded by it. At 26, her face was a map of quiet resilience, her eyes the color of a winter sky, just before the snow falls, holding a depth that spoke of old sorrows and a steely resolve. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from chopping wood, tending her small herd of goats in the warmer months, and aiming the Winchester that now leaned ever ready by the door. She had inherited this homestead, this isolation from her parents, who had sought refuge from a world that had dealt them too many cruel hands. They had passed 3 years ago, taken by a fever in quick succession, leaving Sylvie the sole custodian of their quiet legacy. She had learned to read the moods of the mountains, the language of the wind, and the profound silence of her own heart. The fire sputtered, demanding another log. With a grunt of effort, she heaved a heavy piece of pine onto the embers, sending a shower of orange sparks dancing up the chimney. It was in that momentary lull, as the roar of the fire momentarily subdued the howl of the wind, that she heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the groaning of the cabin's timbers under the weight of the snow. But then it came again, sharper, this time more defined. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a fist against her door, weak yet rhythmic, desperate. Sylvie froze, every muscle tensed. Her gaze darted to the Winchester. No one came calling in a blizzard like this. No sane person, at least. Trappers and prospectors new to hole up. The mail rider was weeks overdue. The nearest neighbor, old Silas Croft, was a good 10 miles away, and he was too wise to brave this tempest. The pounding came again, louder now, laced with a raw, guttural urgency. A voice thin and torn by the wind bled through the wood. "Please, help!" Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the storm's percussion. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, It could be a trick, an outlaw using the storm as cover. The tales that trickled into redemption were filled with stories of men made savage by the harshness of the land. They would see a lone woman as easy prey. She moved silently, her moccasin-clad feet making no sound on the wooden floorboards. She lifted the Winchester. The cold, familiar weight of the rifle was a comfort. She could ignore the sound. She could let the storm, the ultimate arbiter in these parts, decide the fate of whoever was out there. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing to do. But then she pictured a body, frozen solid, buried until the spring thaw. She thought of her father, a man who had never turned away a soul in need. His voice, a low rumble in her memory. A person ain't a person. Ellie, if they can't see the humanity in another. Damn him. Damn his unwavering goodness that she had inherited like a stubborn cowlick. With a curse whispered under her breath, she leaned the rifle against the wall next to the door within easy reach. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of pine smoke and dread, and slid the heavy iron bolt. The door groaned open, wrenched from her grasp by a sudden violent gust of wind that blasted snow and ice into the room, extinguishing the 2 oil lamps on the table and plunging the cabin into a maelstrom of shadow and flickering firelight. He didn't so much step inside as fall collapsing over the threshold in a heap of snow-caked canvas and leather. For a moment, he was just a shape, a dark mound against the furious white of the doorway. Sylvie fought to slam the door shut against the storm's invasion, her shoulder straining against the wood. With a final desperate shove, she managed to latch it, sealing them inside. The cabin was plunged back into the intimate glow of the hearth. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged, shallow breaths of the man on her floor. He lay face down, one arm flung out a pool of melting snow quickly forming around him. His duster, a heavy, trail-worn garment, was stiff with ice. She could see the faint outline of a gun belt buckled around his hips. Moving cautiously, every sense on high alert, Sylvie circled him. She nudged his shoulder with the toe of her boot. "Mr." A low groan was the only reply. She needed to see his face to assess the threat. Kneeling, she grabbed the collar of his duster and pulled, rolling him onto his back. The firelight cast deep shadows across his features, but what she saw sent another jolt of alarm through her. He was young, perhaps her age or a little older. His face, gaunt and stubbled with several days' growth of dark beard, was etched with pain and exhaustion. A nasty gash, raw and red, cut a path across his forehead, his dark hair matted with frozen blood. But it was his eyes that held her. They fluttered open, the irises a startlingly clear blue, like chips of a summer sky trapped in his winter-ravaged face. They were old hunted eyes. Then her gaze fell lower, and her breath caught in her throat. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the right side of his worn woolen shirt, just below his ribs. It was the deep, unmistakable crimson of blood. He was wounded. Badly. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. His lips chapped and blue with cold, moved, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. "Jedediah. They call me Jed." The name meant nothing to her but the look in his eyes. The gun on his hip and the blood seeping from his side told a story she knew all too well. This was a man on the run, a fugitive. His head lolled to the side, his eyes closing. He had fainted. Sylvie stared down at him, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The Winchester was so close. She could end this right now, drag him back outside, and let the storm have him. It would be the smart thing to do. No one would ever know. But as she looked at his pale face, a vulnerability in the slackness of his features, she saw not an outlaw, but a man at the precipice of death. Her father's words echoed again, a gentle reprimand in the howling of the wind. With a sigh of resignation that seemed to carry the weight of the entire storm, she knelt beside him. The decision was made. She was a fool, a damn fool who had just invited the devil into her home. But for now, he was her devil to tend to. She had let him in. She would see this through. Her first task was to get him off the floor and away from the melting snow. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Grunting with exertion, she managed to drag him closer to the fire, his boots leaving wet trails on the floorboards. She propped his head on a rolled-up blanket. Next, the wound. She had to see how bad it was. Her hands hesitated for a moment before she began to unbutton his shirt. The fabric was cold and damp, sticking to his skin. As she pulled it open, the extent of the injury was revealed. It was a bullet wound, ugly. The area around it was swollen, and an angry red, the edges of the wound puckered and inflamed. It wasn't fresh, maybe a day or two old. Infection was already setting in. She rose and went to the small pantry, her movements brisk and efficient now. She gathered what she needed, a basin-clean cloths, the bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes, and her father's old surgical kit. It held a pair of forceps and a wicked-looking probe. She had only ever used them on livestock, but she had watched her father tend to human injuries more than once. Returning to the man's side, she steeled herself. This was going to hurt him, and it wasn't going to be pleasant for her either. She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a cloth and, without ceremony, pressed it against the wound. The man Jed jerked back to consciousness with a strangled cry of agony, his body arching off the floor. His blue eyes flew open wide with shock and pain. He tried to sit up, his hand instinctively going to his side. "Hold still," Sylvie commanded, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She pushed him back down, her hand on his shoulder, surprisingly strong. "This is going to be the easy part. The bullet's still in there. It has to come out." He stared at her, his breathing ragged. The initial shock gave way to a dawning awareness. He looked around the cabin at the fire, at her determined face, and then back down at his side. The reality of his situation seemed to crash down on him. He was trapped at the mercy of a strange woman in the middle of nowhere. Who are you?" he rasped, his voice raw. "The woman whose floor you're bleeding on," she retorted, her tone clipped. "Now are you going to lie still, or am I going to have to tie you down?" He looked from her face to the forceps in her other hand, and seemed to understand she wasn't making an idle threat. He gave a slight, pained nod, and fell back against the blanket. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the floorboards. Sylvie took a deep breath. The storm raged outside, a wild, untamed beast. Inside, in the flickering firelight, another kind of storm was just beginning. She lowered the probe to the wound, the fate of the fugitive in her hands. The silence of the cabin, pregnant with the promise of pain and secrets, yet to be unearthed. The next few hours, she knew, would test the very limits of her strength and her compassion. The first 24 hours were a waking nightmare, a blur of blood whiskey and pain-laced groans that seemed to become one with the relentless moaning of the wind. Sylvie worked with a grim focus, her initial fear sublimated into the immediate pressing task of keeping the man Jed alive. Probing for the bullet was a brutal affair. He writhed and cursed, his body slick with sweat, despite the cabin's chill. But to his credit, he didn't fight her. He bit down on a strip of leather she'd given him. His eyes squeezed shut, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his temple. Sylvie's stomach churned, but her hands remained steady. She was no stranger to the grim necessities of survival. Finally, with a sickening scrape against bone, the forceps closed around the misshapen lump of lead. She pulled it free, dropping the bloody metal into a tin bowl with a clatter that sounded deafeningly loud in the tense silence. After that, she cleaned and stitched the wound as best she could, her needlework precise, if not gentle. She packed the area with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey herbs her mother had taught her to use their sharp, earthy scent, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the sterile bite of whiskey. When she was done, she wrapped his torso tightly with clean linen strips. Exhausted, she slumped back on her heels. Jed lay still, his breathing shallow, his face pale as the snow outside. He had drifted into a fevered, restless sleep. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly look at him, not as a threat or a medical emergency, but as a man. His hands, despite the grime, were not the rough, spade-like hands of a common laborer. His fingers were long, his nails filed. It was a small detail, but it snagged in her mind. His speech, too, even the curses torn from him in agony, had lacked the coarse, unvarnished cadence of the drifters and prospectors she occasionally encountered. There was a ghost of refinement in his voice. Her gaze drifted to the gun belt she had unbuckled and placed on the far side of the hearth. It was well cared for leather, the Colt Peacemaker nestled in the holster, a fine instrument, its handle worn smooth with use. This was not a desperate man who had stolen a gun. This was a man who knew his weapon. The storm showed no sign of abating. The world outside remained a furious, featureless void. They were well and truly trapped. The realization settled in her gut, a cold, heavy stone. She was locked in this tiny cabin with a wounded outlaw, a man who was a complete mystery, a man who could still pose a threat once his strength returned. She spent the rest of the night in the rocking chair, the Winchester across her lap, watching him. She dozed fitfully, her sleep punctuated by the man's fevered murmurs and the storm's ceaseless assault. He spoke in his sleep fragmented words and names that meant nothing to her. "Nathaniel, I couldn't. The ledger. Father, you don't understand." Nathaniel? Was that his real name? Why had he called himself Jed? The mention of father sent a fresh chill down her spine. Every outlaw had a story, a reason for their fall from grace. She wondered what his was. By morning, the fever had worsened. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, his lips cracked. She spent the day forcing sips of willow bark tea and thin broth between his teeth. He was mostly delirious, his blue eyes glassy and unseeing. He flinched at shadows, his hands occasionally reaching for a gun that wasn't there. During one of his more lucid moments as she was changing the dressing on his wound, his eyes focused on her face. The wildness was gone, replaced by a weary vulnerability. "Why?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Why what?" she asked, not looking up from her task. "Why are you helping me?" Sylvie finished tying the bandage and finally met his gaze. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. "My father never turned away a man in need," she said simply, the words feeling both true and inadequate. "I suppose I'm not as smart as he was." A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Or maybe you're better." He lapsed back into delirium, but his words lingered in the quiet cabin, unsettling her more than his presence had. Later that afternoon, a new sound pierced the monotony of the storm. It was a low, mournful howl, but it wasn't the wind. It was closer. Sylvie rushed to the window, wiping away the condensation to peer outside. Through the thick, swirling curtain of snow, she saw them two dark shapes moving slowly, deliberately. Wolves, drawn by the scent of blood. Her blood ran cold. The pack was likely large, emboldened by hunger and the cover of the blizzard. They wouldn't be able to get into the cabin, but their presence was a stark, chilling reminder of the raw, untamed danger that surrounded them. The world was not just a prison. It was a hunting ground. She turned back to the man on the floor. He was a complication, a danger, but he was also the only other human being in her world right now. They were two souls adrift in a sea of white, with predators circling. A strange, unwelcome sense of shared fate began to take root in her heart. That night, as the wolves howled their lonely vigil outside, the man's fever broke. He woke up drenched in sweat, but the glassiness was gone from his eyes. He was weak, but he was lucid. He looked at her, truly looked at her, this time taking in her worn, homespun dress, her braided brown hair, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, and the ever-present rifle that was never far from her reach. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Sylvie just nodded, her throat tight. I need to get out of here as soon as the storm breaks," he said, trying to push himself up. He winced, his hand flying to his side. "You're not going anywhere for at least a week," she stated flatly, pushing him gently but firmly back down. "Not unless you want to bleed out or feed those wolves." He sank back, the fight draining out of him. He stared at the ceiling, at the rough-hewn beams her father had set in place. "They'll be looking for me." "Who's they?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. He turned his head, his blue eyes locking onto hers. There was a war in them, a conflict between caution and the need to trust. A posse, from Redemption, led by a bounty hunter, a man named Silas Kane. Sylvie knew the name. Silas the Vulture Kane, a man as merciless as the winter, who boasted he'd never lost a bounty. He was a spectre that haunted the territories, a harbinger of death. If Kane was after him, Jedediah, or whatever his name was in more trouble than she could have imagined. "What did you do?" she asked, the question blunt. He hesitated, the silence stretching. "They say I robbed a stagecoach. They say I killed a guard." "And did you?" He held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I need to know who I'm sharing my fire with." Another long pause. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the distant hungry cries of the wolves. "No," he said finally, the word barely more than a breath. "I didn't kill anyone." She wanted to believe him. The desperation in his voice, the weary honesty in his eyes, they felt real. But she was a woman who had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were still screaming that there was more to his story. Much more. She decided to let it rest for now. There would be time for more questions. The storm still raged, a great white beast, holding them captive in its maw. For now, a fragile truce had been forged in the heart of the blizzard, a truce built on shared vulnerability and the simple, profound need for another human presence in a world that had suddenly become very small and very, very dangerous. The third day dawned with a subtle shift in the storm's fury. The wind no longer shrieked with the same manic intensity. Its howl had deepened to a mournful, weary groan. The snow still fell, but the flakes were larger, lazier, drifting down from a sky that was a uniform, oppressive grey rather than a churning vortex of white. The siege was not over, but a ceasefire seemed to be approaching. Inside the cabin, a similar shift was underway. The sharp edges of their initial encounter had been worn smooth by proximity and shared ordeal. Jed, as she continued to call him, was stronger. The color had returned to his face, and the fever was now just a bad memory. He insisted on getting off the floor, and with her help, he moved to the small cot in the corner. His movements slow and pained. His presence transformed the small space. It was no longer just her cabin. It was theirs. The silence was different now, no longer the comfortable solitude she was used to, but a space filled with unspoken questions and a simmering tension. To her surprise, he was not a demanding patient. He was quiet, watchful, and insisted on helping in small ways. He would sit at the table for hours, methodically, cleaning and oiling her father's old tools, his long fingers surprisingly deft. He would keep the fire fed, stacking the logs with a quiet efficiency that suggested a familiarity with manual labor. Yet he held the poker with a grace that seemed out of place. Their conversations were like tentative forays into a contested wilderness, circling the dangerous territory of his past. He spoke of growing up in the East, in a city with brick streets and towering buildings, a world away from her reality of mountains and vast, empty skies. He talked about books, about philosophy, about ideas that made her head spin, quoting authors she had never heard of. "You're no simple drifter, are you, Jed?" she said one afternoon, as she kneaded dough for their evening meal, her hands white with flour. He looked up from the harness strap he was mending, a faint wry smile on his lips. "Is any man simple, Sylvie? Some are simpler than others." She countered, her gaze steady. "You speak like a man who's had an education, a good one." His smile faded. He looked down at his hands at the leather strap. "My father. He believed in the power of words. He believed they could build empires or tear them down." "What does your father do?" She pressed her curiosity, a persistent itch. He was silent for a long moment, his expression shuttered. "He's a man of consequence," he said. Finally, his voice flat, discouraging further questions. The cracks in his Jedediah facade were beginning to show, and Sylvie's suspicion, far from abating, was solidifying into a complex, troubling certainty. He was hiding something far more significant than a stagecoach robbery. That evening, the opportunity she had been subconsciously waiting for presented itself. After their meager meal of rabbit stew and fresh bread, Jed, exhausted from his day of sitting upright, fell into a deep sleep on the cot. His breathing was even peaceful. The storm had quieted to a whisper, the snow now falling in a gentle hypnotic curtain. Her heart hammered in her chest. She felt like a thief, a betrayer. He had shown her a sliver of trust, and she was about to violate it. But the need to know the instinct for self-preservation was stronger. She had to know who this man was. She had to know what kind of trouble was heading her way when the snow finally stopped. Moving with the stealth of a cat, she crossed the cabin to where his duster and shirt lay folded on a chair. She had cleaned them as best she could, but she hadn't gone through the pockets. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached into the inner pocket of the duster. It was empty, save for a few stray grains of tobacco. Her hopes sinking, she moved to the shirt. In the small breast pocket, her fingers closed around a piece of folded cloth. She pulled it out. It was a handkerchief made of fine linen, far superior to anything she owned. It was clean, save for a single dark stain she knew was his blood. And in the corner, embroidered with neat, elegant blue thread, was a monogram. N.B. Sylvie stared at the letters, her blood turning to ice. N.B. Not J.B. for Jedediah. Nathaniel B. The name he had mumbled in his fevered delirium. Nathaniel. Her mind raced. Who was Nathaniel B.? The name Blackwood immediately sprang to her mind, an instinctive, chilling connection. Judge Alistair Blackwood was the most powerful man in the territory, a figure of almost mythical authority who resided in the territorial capital 100 miles away, but whose influence was felt even in remote corners like Redemption. He was known for his iron will and his unyielding black-and-white interpretation of the law. Could this man, this fugitive, be connected to him? It seemed impossible, a wild, fanciful leap of logic. But then she remembered the educated speech, the refined hands, the talk of a man of consequence. It all started to slot into place, forming a picture that was both terrifying and utterly compelling. She quickly silently folded the handkerchief and put it back, her mind reeling. She backed away from his clothes, her gaze fixed on the sleeping man on the cot. He looked so peaceful, almost boyish in his sleep. The hard lines of his face softened. Could this man truly be the son of the hanging judge? A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Fear, certainly. If he was Judge Blackwood's son, the posse he spoke of wouldn't just be a handful of men led by a bounty hunter. It would be the full, relentless force of territorial law. And she, Sylvie Hayes, was harboring their fugitive. They would see her as an accomplice, an outlaw herself. They could take everything from her, her home, her freedom, her life. But beneath the fear was something else, something she was ashamed to admit to herself. A thrill, a deep, resonant curiosity, and a burgeoning, dangerous empathy for the man on the cot. He was running from more than just the law. He was running from his own father. The weight of that name, Blackwood, must be a burden heavier than any blizzard. She retreated to her rocking chair, but there was no thought of sleep. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the chill she felt had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, shadows that twisted and writhed like the secrets she was now entangled in. She looked at Nathaniel. She couldn't think of him as Jed anymore, and saw him not as a simple fugitive, but as a man caught in a gilded cage, a man who had clearly broken from a life of privilege and power for reasons she couldn't yet fathom. The crime he was accused of, the stagecoach robbery, and the dead guard, seemed more and more like a convenient lie, a simple story for a complex reality. The storm outside was dying, and with its death, the fragile peace of their sanctuary was doomed. The real world, with all its harsh judgments and unforgiving laws, was waiting just beyond the snow-laden trees. And Sylvie knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that when it arrived, it would not knock politely on the door. It would come to tear her world apart, and she would have to choose a son. The dawn of the fourth day arrived not with a burst of sunlight, but with a quiet, pearlescent glow that filtered through the window. The snow had stopped. A profound, almost sacred silence had fallen over the landscape, the kind of quiet that follows a great and terrible battle. The world outside was reborn, pristine and dazzlingly white, under a sky the color of washed-out slate. The silence was a death knell for their seclusion. Nathaniel was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, testing his weight on his injured side. He looked towards the window, his expression grim. "It's over," he said, the words heavy with finality. "They'll be able to travel now." "You're still not fit to ride," Sylvie stated, stirring the morning's oatmeal with more force than necessary. Her own nerves were stretched taut as a wire. Every sound from outside, the creak of a branch shedding its load of snow, the caw of a distant raven, made her jump. "I don't have a choice," he countered, his voice low and strained. "Kane isn't a patient man. He can track a ghost through a dust storm. This snow, it's a map that leads directly to your door." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a deep, consuming regret. "Sylvie, you need to tell them I forced my way in, that I held you captive. It's the only way you'll stay out of this. And would they believe that—" She shot back, her voice sharp. "When they find you've been fed your wound, stitched and treated, they're not fools." "Then what do you suggest we do?" he asked, a note of desperation creeping into his tone. Before she could answer, a sound cut through the morning stillness, sharp and clear in the thin air. The distinct rhythmic baying of a hound. Nathaniel went rigid. He was on his feet in an instant, ignoring the sharp intake of breath as his wound protested. He grabbed his gun belt from the peg where it hung. "They're here," he whispered, his face a mask of grim resolve. Sylvie's heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to the window, peering cautiously around the edge of the frame. Down the gentle slope that led to her cabin, a group of riders was emerging from the line of snow-heavy pines. There were 5 of them, dark figures, stark against the brilliant white. They were led by a man on a powerful black stallion, a man who sat his horse with an arrogant, predatory stillness. Even from this distance, she could feel the menace radiating from him. He was wrapped in a greatcoat of buffalo hide, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his face. This had to be Silas Kane. "Get away from the window," Nathaniel hissed, pulling her back. His hand was warm on her arm, his touch sending an unexpected jolt through her. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes were steady on his. "There is no plan," he said, his back against the wall beside the door, his Colt now clutched in his hand. "He'll call me out. When I go, you stay put. You don't know anything." "That's not a plan, that's a suicide note," she retorted, her fear transmuting into a hot, defiant anger. She grabbed the Winchester. "This is my home. I don't take kindly to uninvited guests, especially not the kind that travel with hounds and bad intentions." A voice rough as gravel and loud enough to make the window pane rattle boomed from outside. "Nathaniel Blackwood, I know you're in there. The game is up, boy. Come on out and maybe I'll let the woman live." The name spoken aloud in the clear morning air hit Sylvie with the force of a physical blow. Nathaniel Blackwood. It was true. All of it. The man standing beside her, the man she had nursed and argued with and felt a treacherous connection to, was the son of Judge Alistair Blackwood. She looked at him. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. He didn't look surprised that Kane knew his real name. He just looked trapped. "He's lying," Nathaniel said, his voice a low growl. "He won't leave any witnesses." "Then we'd better not give him the chance," Sylvie said, her knuckles white on the stock of her rifle. "Blackwood," Kane's voice echoed again, laced with impatience. "Don't make me burn this shack to the ground with you in it. Your father wants you back. He's worried sick about his prodigal son." The last words were soaked in a venomous sarcasm. "My father," Nathaniel muttered, a look of profound pain flashing across his features. "You have till the count of 3, Kane shouted. 1, Nathaniel looked at Sylvie, a silent, desperate communication passing between them. In that moment, she knew she had already chosen her side. 2. Stay down, he mouthed to her. He took a deep breath, ready to face his fate. But before Cain could shout, 3. Sylvie made her move. She darted to the hearth, grabbed the heavy iron poker, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, smashed it against the side of the stone chimney. A cascade of soot ash and smoke billowed into the room. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel choked, his eyes watering. "Creating a diversion." "Now go!" she yelled, shoving him towards the small shuttered window at the back of the cabin, the one that looked out over the steep wooded ravine. "There's a goat path about 20 yards down. Follow it. It'll lead you to the caves by the frozen creek. Go." He hesitated, his eyes locked on hers through the swirling grey haze. "Sylvie, I can't leave you. You can and you will," she cried, coughing. "I can hold them off. They want you, not me." "Now get out of here, Nathaniel Blackwood." The sound of his full name on her lips seemed to break his paralysis. He gave her one last, searing look, a look of gratitude, of anguish, of something more she couldn't decipher. Then he unlatched the rear window and scrambled out, disappearing into the white wilderness. Just as he vanished, the cabin door splintered inwards, kicked off its hinges by a heavy boot. Silas Cain stood there, framed in the doorway, his peacemaker leveled. His face was cruel and sharp-featured, with pale reptilian eyes that scanned the smoke-filled room. "Well now," he drawled, a smirk twisting his thin lips. "Look what we have here. A little spitfire." His men fanned out behind him, their guns drawn. "He's gone." Sylvie said, her voice steady, despite the violent trembling in her hands. She held the Winchester, but it was pointed at the floor. She knew she was no match for fit-armed men. Cain's eyes narrowed. "Where did he go, girlie?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" she spat. The bounty hunter chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Feisty. I like that. But you're making a big mistake. A fatal one. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, especially when that fugitive is the son of the man who signs my pay warrants." He took a step into the cabin, his boots crunching on the debris. "But you see, this ain't just about the bounty for me. This is personal." "What are you talking about?" Sylvie asked, stalling for time, praying Nathaniel was getting away. Cain's smirk widened, becoming something ugly and triumphant. "You think the boy is running because he robbed a stagecoach? That's the story the good judge wants everyone to believe. Simple, clean, protects the family name." He took another step, his presence sucking the air from the room. "But that ain't the truth," Cain continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The truth is far messier. Young Nathaniel didn't rob any stagecoach. He did something much, much worse in his father's eyes." He paused, savoring the moment, his cold eyes fixed on Sylvie. "He killed his own brother." The words hung in the smoke-filled air, heavy and poisonous. Sylvie stared at him, her mind refusing to process the information. It couldn't be true. The man she had saved. A killer. A fratricide. "That's right," Cain said, seeing the shock and horror on her face. "Stabbed his older brother Thomas right through the heart during a quarrel. Judge Blackwood, for all his talk of justice, couldn't bring himself to see his last remaining son hang. So he concocted the stagecoach story, a lesser crime, and hired me to bring him in quietly. He wants to ship the boy off somewhere far away, out of sight, out of mind. But I have other plans. I have a score to settle with the Blackwood clan." Thomas Blackwood was the man who sent my own brother to the gallows on false testimony. Kane's face was a mask of vengeful glee. So you see, girlie, you haven't been sheltering some romantic outlaw. You've been keeping a cold-blooded killer warm by your fire. The twist was so vicious, so utterly unexpected, that it knocked the breath from Sylvie's lungs. The entire foundation of the fragile trust she had built with Nathaniel crumbled into dust. The man she had risked everything for wasn't a noble victim of circumstance. He was a monster hiding behind a handsome face and educated words, and she had just sent him free. The revelation struck Sylvie with the force of a physical blow. Fratricide. The word was ugly, a sin that stained the soul. She stared at Silas Kane's triumphant smirk, the image of Nathaniel's pained face now twisted into that of a monster. Kane's men were already moving, two heading out back to follow the tracks in the snow. "He won't get far," Kane sneered. "My dogs can smell Blackwood blood a mile away." Something inside Sylvie snapped. As Kane's words echoed, a single insistent doubt surfaced. This is personal. Kane had admitted to a vendetta. He had every reason to paint Nathaniel in the worst possible light. And Nathaniel. He had looked at her with such anguish, not the coldness of a killer. Just then, she heard it, a faint two-note whistle, almost lost in the vast silence. The signal. Trouble. He was close. He hadn't abandoned her. In that instant, her choice was made. She would gamble on the devil she knew. "He went north," Sylvie said, her voice steady, as she pointed the Winchester away from the ravine. "Towards the old Trapper's Pass. Said he had a horse stashed there." Kane's eyes narrowed, searching her face for deceit before barking orders. "Jedediah, search the pass, Caleb, with me. The rest of you follow the dogs. Find him. The judge wants him alive," he added with a wicked smile, but he didn't say in how many pieces. As the others dispersed, Kane turned his full attention on Sylvie, leaning against the doorframe with casual menace. "A lonely woman like you must get desperate for company." Did he whisper sweet nothings while his brother's blood was still on his hands? "He was a stranger who needed help," Sylvie said, her voice cold. "I did what any decent person would do." "Decency." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "There's only the quick and the dead out here, girlie. You chose the wrong side." Suddenly, a sharp crack from the woods behind Kane echoed through the valley. Caleb, the man beside him, grunted and pitched forward into the snow, a dark stain spreading across his back. "He's in the trees!" Kane roared, spinning around and firing his pistol blindly into the pines. This was her chance. As Kane was distracted, Sylvie lunged for the hearth, grabbing the heavy iron skillet. With a scream, born of terror and rage, she swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of Kane's head with a sickening thud. The bounty hunter staggered, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Shaking his head to clear it, he raised his pistol, his eyes burning with murder. He fired the shot, deafening inside the cabin, the bullet splintering the floorboards inches from her. Before he could fire again, Nathaniel burst through the shattered doorway. He didn't use his gun. He launched himself at Kane like a cornered wolf, tackling him around the waist. The two men crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and feral snarls. Kane was bigger, but Nathaniel was fueled by a desperate fury. He drove his fists into Kane's face until the bounty hunter landed a heavy punch to Nathaniel's wounded side. Nathaniel cried out, the fight draining from him. Kane seized the advantage, rolling on top and closing his powerful hands around Nathaniel's throat. "I'm going to enjoy this, Blackwood," he hissed, his face contorted with hate. Nathaniel's face began to turn purple, his hands clawing uselessly at Kane's wrists. Seeing his life about to be extinguished, Sylvie scrambled for her Winchester. She didn't have a clear shot. Reversing the rifle, she gripped the barrel like a club. "Get off him!" she screamed, and brought the heavy wooden stock down hard on the back of Kane's head. There was a dull crack. Kane's body went limp, collapsing heavily on top of Nathaniel. The cabin fell silent, save for the sound of ragged, gasping breaths. Nathaniel shoved the unconscious bounty hunter off him and staggered to his feet, clutching his side. He looked from Kane's still form to Sylvie, who stood fierce and defiant in the ruins of her home. "Sylvie," he breathed her name a prayer. "You have a lot of explaining to do," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Starting with your brother." From outside, shouts erupted. The other men, drawn by the gunshots, were coming back. "No time," Nathaniel said, grabbing her arm. "We have to go, now." He pulled her towards the back of the cabin, towards the ravine and the hope of escape. Sylvie didn't hesitate. Taking one last look at her violated home, she followed him into the cold, white, unforgiving wilderness. The questions could wait. Survival came first. The escape was a desperate, lung-burning flight into the white wilderness. Nathaniel, leaning heavily on Sylvie, led them down a steep, wooded ravine, the shouts of Kane's men a fading threat behind them. They finally stumbled into the shelter of a shallow cave, its entrance curtained by frozen icicles, and collapsed against the cold stone wall, their breaths pluming in the frigid air. For a long moment, the only sound was their own ragged breathing. The pristine silence of the wilderness pressed in on them, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos they had just escaped. Sylvie was the first to speak, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Tell me the truth, Nathaniel. All of it. I've earned that much." He met her gaze, his face a mask of pain that went far deeper than his wound. He nodded slowly. "You've earned more than that, Sylvie. You saved my life." He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the story spilled from him a tragic narrative of family duty and corruption. "My brother Thomas was my father's golden boy," he began. "Ambitious, devoted, and utterly convinced of our father's righteousness. I was not. I saw how Judge Alistair Blackwood's justice was a weapon he and Thomas used to serve the powerful." Nathaniel's voice dropped, laced with bitterness. "I discovered they were running a land-grabbing scheme, with a railroad baron using the courts to bankrupt homesteaders and seize their land. They kept a secret ledger detailing the bribes, the false testimonies, the lives they were destroying. The man Kane's brother. He was one of their victims." The night it happened, Nathaniel had found the ledger and confronted them. "The argument was violent," he said, his eyes closing as if to block out the memory. "Thomas was enraged, called me a traitor. He came at me trying to silence me for good. We struggled. There was a heavy brass letter opener on the desk. He lunged, and I tried to push him away. He fell, the opener. It went into his chest." Nathaniel's face was a study in anguish. "It was an accident, Sylvie. A horrific, tragic accident. But my father walked in at that exact moment. He didn't see his son's tragedy. He saw a threat to the Blackwood name." The judge's reaction was cold and calculated. "He gave me a choice," Nathaniel said, his voice hollow. "Hang for a murder I didn't commit, or disappear forever." He concocted the stagecoach story, a manageable crime, to explain my flight. He hired Kane to hunt me down, not for justice, but to bury me in an asylum back east. To bury the truth with me. He finished his story, the terrible weight of it settling in the small cave. Sylvie looked at him, at the raw, unguarded truth in his haunted eyes, and she believed him completely. The pieces fit, forming a picture far more tragic than Kane's simple tale of villainy. She understood now that he wasn't just fleeing the law. He was fleeing the suffocating shadow of a father who would sacrifice his own son to protect his name. Wordlessly, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture of comfort, of solidarity, but it was everything. He looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of warmth eased the cold despair in his eyes. "What now?" she asked softly. "Cain will be hunting us, and your father will never stop." "I know." He admitted, his gaze falling. "To run is just to delay the inevitable. The ledger is still in his study. It's the only proof I have." A desperate, audacious idea sparked in Sylvie's mind. The world had crashed into her solitary life and reforged her. "Then we don't run," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that startled them both. "We go back." Nathaniel stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Back to redemption. "No," she said, her eyes shining with a wild, defiant light. "We go to the capital, to your father's house. They're hunting you in the wilderness. The last place on earth they'll expect you to be is in the lion's den." It was a suicidal plan, a fool's errand, but it was also the only path that led toward justice instead of just away from death. A slow smile spread across Nathaniel's face, the first genuine smile she had ever seen. It transformed him, erasing the lines of pain and revealing the man he might have been. "The lion's den," he repeated softly. "Sylvie Hayes, you're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or you're completely insane." "Probably a little of both," she admitted, a wry grin touching her lips. "You're a judge's son on the run, and I'm a woman who just clubbed a bounty hunter with a skillet. I'd say we're a good match." They would not run. They would fight. As dusk cast long blue shadows across the snow, they prepared to travel under the cover of darkness, heading not away from danger, but toward its very heart. Their future was an uncertain wilderness, but for the first time, they were facing it together. So what happened to Sylvie and Nathaniel? Did they manage to retrieve the ledger from the heart of the lion's den? Did Judge Blackwood's empire of corruption come crashing down, or did he succeed in burying his secrets and his son forever? The journey to the capital is fraught with peril, with the full weight of the territory's law against them, and the vengeful Silas Cain never far behind. Their story doesn't end here in this frozen cave. It's just the beginning of a new, even more dangerous chapter. If you were captivated by the story of the homesteader and the judge's son, and want to find out what happens next, make sure to hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with anyone who loves a good Wild West drama filled with twists and turns. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss the thrilling continuation of The Snowstorm Trapped Her. Your support helps us create more stories like this. What do you think they should do next? Leave your theories in the comments below.